In our scripture lesson today, in verse 16, it says, "We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for one another." Does anybody know who this is? There are some people that are nodding. This woman's name is Tammy Jo Schultz. And she will be forever ingrained in our memory, for she did something that was almost miraculous in nature on Tuesday. She was the pilot of Southwest Flight 1380, originating at LaGuardia Airport in New York. And if you have not listened to the news, this was the flight that was on its way to San Antonio, and about 20 minutes after it took off, they had engine failure. And one of the blades of the jet fan, or the engine fan, broke off and flew into the jet, and tragically, one person was killed. But after the emergency happened, this woman, who was a former fighter pilot in the U.S. Navy, guided this plane filled with some 144 people to safety in Philadelphia. She is a hero, but more than that, she is one who lives by what we just heard in verse 16 of our reading today. We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for one another. We ought to lay down our lives one another. Today we begin another message from the first letter of John. And if you remember from last week, if you were here, I noted several things about this certain epistle. One is that it was probably written by the same person who wrote the Gospel of John as well as the book of Revelation. Number two, the writer of John was someone who you would call a mystic. Someone who believed in looking at Jesus both as human and also as divine. But the most important thing about this particular epistle, and also the most important thing about the writer John, is that permeating throughout his writings is this idea of love. Love of God and love of neighbor. Yesterday, Kathy and I were sitting around watching TV, and Kathy turned on television, and we were able to sit there and watch the celebration of life for Barbara Bush. Now, Mrs. Bush was almost a larger-than-life character. But the one thing that I noticed throughout the remembrance for Mrs. Bush was that there were two things that seemed to shine forth in her life above all others. One is that her unquenchable love for her family. 2 daughters, 4 sons, one daughter of which she lost tragically at the age of 3 to leukemia. she had an unabiding strength of love for her family. But the other thing that I heard over and over again in the eulogies and what they said about Barbara Bush was that she also had a love of neighbor. This quote here, "Never lose sight of the fact that the most important yardstick of your success will be how you treat other people, your family, friends, and co-workers, and even strangers you meet along the way." Little children, it says in the epistle, "Let us love not in word or speech, but in truth and action." Let us love in truth and in action. Sometimes hard to do that. Sometimes hard to do that when you come across people who seemingly are very difficult to love. We all have those people in our lives. It may be someone who we have a hard time loving because we have a difference of opinion. It may be someone that we have a hard time loving because they've done something to us that has wounded our psyche, wounded our souls. It may be someone that we have a hard time loving because they do things in their lives that we do not approve of. But what the epistle writer is telling us to do is that we are to love not in word and speech, but in truth and action. As many of you know, I am very much a person that pays attention to history and to current events. And I was remembering when I was preparing for this sermon, two people in the course of our United States history that were at the opposite ends of the political spectrum. These two people were, in the middle on the right was Ronald Reagan, President of the United States from 1981 to 1989. And then we have on the left there, the man with the white hair, Tip O'Neill, who was Speaker of the House of Representatives during the time that Reagan was in office. Tip O'Neill was your classic Democrat in the sense that he was almost brought up in Democratic politics from day one in the city of Boston. He rose through the ranks and eventually became Speaker of the House. And he believed very strongly that government needed to work for people, not against people. And then on the other side of the aisle was Ronald Reagan, someone who started out as an actor, but became governor of our great state and then eventually President of the United States. And Ronald Reagan was very passionate about his side of the aisle in terms of politics. So you would think from our perspective today that these two men would not get along, that they would sit in opposite ends of their political spectrum and be very intransigent, unmoving in their opinions and in their beliefs. But what was amazing about these two men, and something that needs to be a lesson for today's political arena, was that even though these men had a lot of differences, they were able to come together. And they were able to put aside any political differences, and they could still be friends. They could still communicate with one another, and in the process of that, they got things done for our country. Something that we don't see very often today. They were able to love one another, not in word or speech, but in truth and action. In truth and action, that's the crux of what I believe this passage to be. To love one another in truth and action. I believe that in this world that is very, very difficult to do at times. Because at times we are divided. I noted that we are divided in our politics. But I think that even as United Methodists, and I'm kind of speaking to the in crowd here, if you're not United Methodists, I'm sorry. But I believe that we as United Methodists are divided. And I say that because we are divided, because we refuse to really live what it means to have love in our lives. For we are divided over an issue that I think is an issue that is something that is very important, but the world on the outside is looking at us and saying, you are not being the church. And that is as it pertains to our love and care for our LGBTQ people. We say that we are an open church, yet our church law states that we do not ordain people who are LGBTQ. Nor can we marry LGBTQ people in our sanctuary. We are a divided church. In 2016, at our general conference, we came together and we decided that instead of fighting over this issue, that we would come together once again in one of our multitude of commissions, and we would study this issue again. And we would try to have the final word through this commission on where we were going in the future of the United Methodist Church. And so this commission is met, and what they have come forward with is that in order for us to remain as a church, we're going to have to do certain things. But those things that they are proposing still are exclusionary. And what I mean by that is that they want to acknowledge the fact that we are a divided church, but they also want to try to live together. They want to try to live together in a creative tension where some congregations and some people do not want to have people who identify as LGBTQ in their congregation. And for me, that grieves me. That grieves me because that is not authentic, and that is not what our scripture passage talks about today. We need to love people without reservation. We need to love people and accept people where they are. And yet, there are certain people in our denomination that put certain stipulations on that love. And I have to confess to you today that if we become a church like that, if we decide that we want to be a church that is united only in name only, but we do not love unequivocally, that we do not love with our whole heart, and we do not accept everybody into our congregations, then we are not a church. And I don't know where the future is with this whole issue. But what I want to emphasize to you today is that in this congregation, that as long as I'm your pastor, we will be an open and affirming congregation. And we will be a congregation that will love abundantly. We will be a congregation that will love without reservation. We will be a congregation that will not put any stipulations on our love. This is an issue where I draw the line, because I just cannot be any other way than a person that tries to live Christ's love. And the love that I know that comes from Christ is one that places no barriers, no boundaries. And I hope that as you go forward, that you will also recognize that love, that justice, that mercy that only comes from God, and we witness through Jesus. Because that is a love worth living. That is a love, in some cases, where people have died for that love and the witness of that love. And that is a love where I choose to be this day and every day in my life. Amen and amen.